Welcome again. My name is Natalie Larson, and I'm the Director of Family Services. Joining us as well today from Family Services is Pauline Lee, our Resource and Referral Specialist. Thank you for joining us today for this presentation on teen well-being. I would also like to extend our thanks and appreciation for our subject matter experts who have made this possible today. In terms of housekeeping, thank you for those that sent your questions in ahead of time. And if you have any additional questions, please use the Q&A function, and those will be answered at the end of the presentation. Also, this session will be recorded for future viewing, and a link to the slides will be provided. And now, with further ado, I would like to introduce our presenters. Joining us today is Dr. Lindsey Bruett, UCSF Associate Clinical Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and psychologist, Dr. Evan Holloway, UCSF Assistant Clinical Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and psychologist, and Dr. Lauren Haack, UCSF Associate Clinical Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and psychologist. And now I will turn it over to our presenters.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for having us, for hosting us. We're really excited to be here. So today, the title of our talk is Supporting Your Teen's Well-Being. It's a conversation. We're going to answer questions at the end, but a conversation with us as some mental health experts. And we also consider y'all the real experts in working with teens. So we'll get started. So on our agenda today is first, I'm going to talk about adolescence as a real time of opportunity and beauty. And then we're going to talk about ways that you can support your teen and their well-being, some tips and strategies about how to know if more help is needed and when to access that help. And then we're going to share a lot of resources, as we hope this is kind of a starting point to talk about a number of important topics, but we want to make sure you're equipped and prepared to keep investigating and reading going forward. All right, so what is adolescence? I think it's helpful to orient us to that, as there's a lot of different definitions and it can be thought about in a lot of different ways. We think about adolescence as this period broadly starting at about age 10 and extending until age 25. And we'll talk about why it goes to 25 and not 18 as kind of the cutoff for adulthood legally. But it's a broad age range, and there are a lot of things that happen across this about 15-year period. Adolescence is defined by near constant change, and that is not linear, right? So things can change, very quickly and kind of stay, maybe plateau for a bit, and continue changing. But that change is really defined by increasing independence over time, changes in increased risk-taking and sensation-seeking, which is both, there are some things to pay attention to make sure that people, your kids are staying safe, but also risk-taking and sensation-seeking are really important for development and actually really positive things. It's also a time where your teens are thinking about who they are, and so forming their identity, thinking about, ways that they might present themselves, ways that they think about themselves, things that they're interested in, and that can change and should change over time as well. But it's really an opportunity for sort of experimentation and thinking about who you are, who you want to be. And so one thing I just we felt it important to start with is that adolescence and thinking about, like working with teens, I get this a lot as a provider, like, oh, that must be hard. And I want to say we view this as like a really beautiful period. These changes are all really normal and necessary to prepare for adulthood. So we just wanted to reorient this is a real opportunity for strength and beauty. So first, as I said, we count on y'all as the experts. And so I'd like you to think about, I'm going to change this to a better resolution. So I'd like everybody to go to menti.com if you're on your computer or your phone. There's a code at the top, or you can take your phone and point it at this QR code. And I'd like you to remember your adolescence and pick 1 to 5 words that describe your experience. And so we'll give everybody a minute or so to start entering that in. And I'm going to give some live feedback. Wild. I love that that's the first one. Awkward. Absolutely fun, scary, right? And we're seeing some really positive and maybe a little, you know, more challenging words here. 2 sides of the same coin. Stressful, lonely, courageous. Awkward is really sticking out here. And everybody, I assume most people know how a word cloud works, but the bigger words are those that are being that kind of have the largest number of participants. Oh, this is beautiful. Okay, we've got more and more coming in. Ooh. Let me see. There we go. All right, now this is working. Okay, hard, scary, wild, horrible, goofy, unsure. Yeah, self-deprecating, fashion challenge. So I'm seeing a lot highlighting this kind of identity formation, really, and highlighting a lot of change, right? Both challenging and beautiful. Fun is one that is fun and free are popping up here for me. So thank you all so much. All right, so keeping that in mind, oh, there's more, okay. All right, this is, no, it's not progressing, 1 second. There we go, okay. 1 second, I don't know why this is not letting me progress, there we go. So okay, I'm just gonna stop share 1 second and go to the next screen. First time webinar here. Thanks for your patience. All right, can everybody see that? Great. So I wanted to introduce, there's a model that I think a lot about in terms of development. There's a lot of colors here and a lot of words, but I'd like you to bring your attention to the center where it says individual. This is the Bronfenbrenner model of bioecological development. And I think about this as like an onion, right? And so I'd like you to focus first in the center. Think about that as yourself as a teen or your teen. So at the individual level, there are a lot of predispositions, genetic predispositions, there are temperament, right? A lot of like biological predispositions and things like that. And so you can kind of think about at the individual levels where we're starting, when your child was born or when you were born, and then every level outside represents different levels of the environment or ecological systems. And so in early childhood, the family microsystem is sort of the most proximal to the individual, has a huge influence on development, things that you like, opportunities that you have, different challenges that you might have, and behavior that's modeled for you with your family. And so your family has a huge influence. As we age, friends become more and more important. And this is especially germane to adolescent development. And so as you age, family is still there, but it becomes a little bit less, primary, and friends become more primary. There's also opportunities for interacting with other folks in different microsystems. So the schools that you go to and peers that you interact with there, who might be friends, might not be, your neighbors, the type of work that you engage in. And then outside of that, there are this exosystem. So kind of look at this green circle. These are more ecological, environmental influences. So government policy, your parents, friends, extended family, exposure to mass media, all have an influence on the systems within, right? So that's where I think about this as layers of an onion. Outside of that is the macro system. This is the society that we live in, political systems, culture, so things like social media, the internet, right? That might be different. It's definitely different from when I was growing up as a teenager, and different policies, politics, things like that affect things like reproductive health, and job opportunities, things like that. And then outside is the chronosystem. So this really just highlights that everything within changes over time. And so wanted to just orient you to all the different things that influence and drive development. But we're going to talk a lot, or at least I'm going to talk a lot more about sort of this individual and then the friends and family influence in adolescence. Okay, so adolescence has a lot of different stages. So there's no, I just want to say with all of these, this is kind of a rough estimate for the age range because every kid is different. And they might start a little earlier, end a little bit later. There's a lot of variation, and that's what makes us unique. So starting on the left, early adolescence is broadly thought of as occurring between the ages of 10 to 13, defined by puberty, pubertal development starting. And with that is an increased need for privacy and independence, right? And a little bit of pulling away from sharing everything maybe with your family. That is normal. Peers become increasingly important. And with having more influence from your peers and the need for more independence, again, which are healthy things, there's also more independence in thinking. And so that can lead to some disagreements. And it might, and just to reorient to you, like that might be really challenging in the moment, but it's actually a really important skill for your teens to learn how to navigate in the world. Moving on to middle adolescence, this is about age 14 to 17. We see more secondary sexual characteristics as puberty continues to flood with hormones. It's also a time where, and again, this can happen before or later, but it's a time where commonly teens start to explore their sexual identity and romantic attraction more. Peers become most influential in this period. And it is common for teens to spend less time with their family and want to spend more time with their friends. Late adolescence is broadly between ages 17 and 21. And this, is a time period where teens may live independently. And when they hit 18, are legally considered an adult. So with that comes things like maybe more increased financial responsibility and other opportunities like joining the military, right? Or having other types of responsibilities and opportunities. This is also, thankfully, a time where there's increased impulse control as our brain continues to develop, and all those hormones are still, creating an influence, but it's not like this big surge of development that we see in early to mid-adolescence. Moving on to young adulthood, broadly age 21 to 25, your young adult likely lives independently, they may not. And this is where you can think about, there might be an opportunity to transition into more of a friendship. You're not like a friend, right? But as opposed to the earlier stages, as a parent, you might think about, what do I want my relationship to be like with my young adult teen as they transition into adulthood, where they're likely living on their own. One thing I wanted to highlight, this is a graph kind of highlighting teens' responses to questions about risky situations, like getting in a car with someone who might be under the influence, or other things where they might not be really thinking about the consequences of their actions. Is you can see that risk preference kind of really peaks between ages 14 and 17, and then it starts to decrease age 21, and then all the way down to 22, and even further, right? And the reason for this is that the part of our brain that helps us to regulate our emotions, our behavior, and kind of think about the future and the consequences is the prefrontal cortex. And this isn't really fully developed until age 25, which is why we think about a period of adolescence really stretching to 25. And this quote from where this paper came from, I thought really encapsulated this, which is that it's like starting an engine without yet having a skilled driver. Just want to highlight that adolescence is a tremendous opportunity to foster autonomy. And so discussing rationale, kind of higher level thinking with your teens, their perspectives and opinions, repetition and practice with them, right, to help support their ability to make their own decisions as they transition towards adulthood. It is really important to help lead them to live an empowered life. It's also a great opportunity to model healthy behavior. Teens are always watching, even if it seems like they're on their phones. And so what behaviors they're exposed to, either within your home, their neighborhood, their schools, are being modeled for them, right? Which is a very effective form of learning. Also, safety first is really important. Again, this is a time where your brain is not fully developed, but a lot of other parts of your body are developing very rapidly. So communication is really key. Safety over everything, right? There are opportunities, and Lindsey and Lauren are going to talk more about some of those specific skills, but communication and prioritizing safety is super important in this period. Don't wait for a risky situation to come up before you discuss a plan for how you would like your teens to interact with you. Okay, and with that, I'm going to pass it over to Lindsey. Thank you.
Thanks so much. All right, so thinking about how do we support teen mental health? Next slide, please. I want to caveat all of this. So I'm a cisgender white female. I come at my life from that perspective. That's a lived experience I have. The research, much of the research that's been done in the areas of parenting and also adolescent development have unfortunately excluded many minoritized groups. And parenting is very cultural. I don't have to tell you all that because you're in the trenches of it. And so, you know, a lot of what I present, it may or may not fit for you. My hope is that you can sort of take what we know from the available literature there is and really think through for yourself what feels authentic and what feels values consistent for you and your family. Next slide, please. Okay, parents have a really hard job. So there's a couple of things I like to start out by kind of putting out there as a frame for all of us as we're having this conversation today. So one is that parents are really important. Caregivers are really important. We know that they do impact adolescent development. When we look at kind of outcomes, we can see that parenting practices do play a role in teens' outcomes. How well they're doing, areas in which they're struggling, things like that can all be impacted by caregiving practices. At the same time, there are a million other influences on one's teen. And so when we look at this literature, parenting, you know, it plays a role, and sometimes it's a fairly small role, depending on what we're talking about. Evan was talking about how in the adolescent years, it's normal that things like peers, school, other cultures that our young people are embedded in start to play a larger role. And so I want to have kind of send parents the message that yes, what you're doing is incredibly important, and there's a million other influences out there. And so not all of the impacts, you know, not all of the outcomes that your kids experience are going to be a direct result of what you do, which is probably both reassuring and scary at the same time. But I hope you take it as reassuring in this context. Also, the idea that we can't prevent challenges for kids, and actually it wouldn't be a good thing if we could prevent every challenge that teens are going to face. We know that a sort of moderate level of stressful situations and having to navigate challenges are what help us to build resilience. And so those things are going to come up, and we hope that your job as a parent is to sort of help hold hands and navigate those situations. And then thinking about self-compassion. We're all doing the best we can. We can always do better, and we're all doing the best we can. All families will struggle in certain ways at certain times. That's unavoidable. Next slide, please. Okay, so a couple situations for us to think through. One is, my kid won't talk to me. This is something that the parents I work with come to my office a lot with. And I have a couple of suggestions here. So there's a psychologist who does a lot of writing and speaking around adolescence named Lisa D'Amour, who I really admire. And she writes about what she calls potted plant parenting. And what she means is that it can be really helpful when teens are living in your house to be around. We can't all be around all the time, right? You have jobs, you have other competing demands, but when possible, to kind of try to be around in the spaces and places where your kids are hanging out. So maybe choosing to do, if you're tapping away at your laptop after hours, maybe doing that in a common area instead of in your private office or in your room or wherever you tend to work. So that, you know, the idea behind this is that teens often, we can't always predict when they're going to want to share or when they're going to feel open to talking. And so being available can create opportunities for them to share things with you. We also know that teens tend to be less inhibited later in the evening when they're kind of more tired and their energy is waning. And that can be a time when they may be more prone to sharing because they're maybe feeling less kind of inhibited or sort of worried about what you're going to say. They may open up at those times. That can be challenging because it's oftentimes when parents are wanting to go to sleep. And of course, we want you to value your sleep as well, but things to think about here. Another thing is doing things together. So oftentimes families can find it hard, especially with teens, to find things that they all enjoy. But one thing we really know from the literature is that it doesn't need to be extravagant. Doesn't even need to be a super long period of time that you're spending together. Even, maybe once in a while, taking a walk around the block with the dog in the evening or running an errand together. That time matters. And it doesn't need to feel like it's an agenda of like, what am I going to ask my kid? What are they going to talk about? We need to make really good use of that time. Just spending time together can really do a lot to enhance the parent-teen relationship. When you are asking questions of your teen, when appropriate, we encourage asking open-ended questions. So an example would be like, did you get all your homework done? That would be a close-ended question, right? The answer is yes or no, versus, hey, what are you working on this evening? Which kind of might give your teen the opportunity to tell you a little bit more about what's going on at school. Or it might be something like, which of your friends are you're having the most fun with these days? Inviting more conversation. And then another is showing an interest in their interests. This can be hard depending on what your kids' interests are, but an example of this might be maybe your young person is playing a video game and they're wrapping up and you're kind of walking by and you might say something like, hey, like, what do you like about that game? What's fun about that? Tell me about the people that you're playing with. Even if video games are not really your forte, I know that they're not really for me, but we can sometimes learn things about what makes our teens tick, what they're interested in by asking those questions. Next slide, please. Okay, so they've shared a little. What do you do to kind of keep that going, to not shut down? I think we've all been in the situation where a teen shares a little bit and we say something and it kind of shuts it down. That's inevitable. It's going to happen sometimes, but here are some tips to try to mitigate that. So the number one skill that I teach to parents in my clinical work is validation. So this would be, if Evan said to me, hey, Lindsey, I'm feeling really overwhelmed at work because I have 3 presentations in the next week. I might say something like, man, it really makes sense that you're feeling overwhelmed. That sounds like a lot of work. So it's kind of acknowledging that I hear what Evan's saying, that he feels overwhelmed, and we can absolutely do this with teens as well. And here's some sentence stems that you might use. Sometimes people will say, I understand how you feel. That's one to be careful with, and only say if you truly do understand how the young person feels, which you may or may not, depending on what they're describing. I hear you can be a really useful way to validate somebody, and just let them know that you're listening. They're describing their day and how much is going on for them, and you're saying, man, I hear you. That really sounds like a lot. Validation is not the same as agreement. So say your teen is describing a social situation and they're saying, oh, I was so mad at this person. They did this thing. They sat in my seat at lunch, and you're thinking like, really, you were so mad just because they sat in your seat at lunch? Just because you say, I hear you that you were mad, that doesn't mean that you agree with the way they handled the situation, or you even agree that you would feel mad in that situation. It's just letting your teen know that you're hearing what they're saying to you, which can be really powerful. Okay, most of us as humans, we want to solve problems, especially with the people we love. We want to understand what's going on, and then we want to fix it. And most of us probably know if we're people that tend to jump really quickly to problem solving. Particularly with teens, we want to be really careful to try not to do that. And you might even consider asking permission before you jump into problem solving mode. Hey, I want to ask, do you just want me to listen right now, or do you want help figuring out how to handle this? They may not want help figuring out how to handle it. And as long as it's, not a dangerous situation or a situation where you really feel obligated to intervene, you want to respect that. Sometimes when teens start sharing things, especially if they haven't been sharing much with their parents or caregivers, parents can understandably feel very surprised by what they're sharing. Maybe a teen is sharing something that feels kind of shocking, like the substance use that's happening in their class at school, or an argument that their friends got in, something like that. I want to try to help you balance sort of authenticity and then what's going to help to enable your teen to share, right? Because the problem is if we react with surprise, shock, or anger, if we react with surprise or shock, we're inadvertently sending the message that we can't handle what they're telling us. And that's going to likely make them less likely for them to share in the future. Similarly, if we're reacting in anger, anger is a really natural response to when we feel fearful, and often hearing things that are going on in adolescents' lives can make us feel fearful because sometimes they're risky. But we want to kind of be careful to try to stay grounded in the real emotion, which might be fear. So you might share something like, oh, wow, like, thank you so much for sharing that. It worries me to hear that, and I'm so glad you shared it with me. And then this final one is hopefully fairly obvious. We all know that we usually like to share things with people who are good listeners and not with people who are going to give us lectures about how we should be doing things or how it was when we were young, things like that. Next slide, please. All right, so I'd like to open up the chat if we may. And I'd like folks, if you would, to think about the best boss you've ever had, or the best bosses that you've had in your working years. And I'd like you to please type into the chat, what did those bosses do that made them so great? We'll give folks a minute. Provide autonomy, encouragement, development, good listeners, empathic listening, warm, open, inviting, encouraging, not micromanaging, listening, always available, good coach or mentor, flexible, compassion, help set expectations, communicative, provided professional development, hands-off, supported when needed, treated everybody fairly, clear expectations, asked what resources are needed, advocated, awesome, approachable. I certainly missed some, but these are awesome. Please feel free to keep them coming, and I really appreciate folks participating. Next slide, please. So it turns out that we can take some learning from what you've all experienced with your best bosses into thinking about how is it that we can get teens and young people to do things that they don't want to do, that we need them to do, which might be getting homework done, getting chores done, being kind to their siblings, all those sorts of things that tend to happen in families. So there's a couple principles here. One is that all of us as humans, and actually all animals in general, we are much more likely to increase a behavior if it's reinforced than to decrease a behavior that's punished. So this is a kind of roundabout way of saying, you know, if I say I'm having trouble submitting my clinical notes on time, if my boss starts praising me every time I submit a clinical note on time, that's going to be much more effective than if my boss starts yelling at me every time my note is late. So really leaning on trying to look for times to catch your young person being good and doing the things you want them to be doing, and then pointing that out and praising them in a really specific way. So not just, hey, great job this afternoon, but hey, Johnny, I noticed when you got home from school, you sat right down and did your homework after you had your snack. I was so impressed to see that. That's awesome. You can even go so far. Sometimes it can be helpful to set up a reward system. That's absolutely an option, but honestly, just praise and attention can really go a really long way. Another thing is to be really clear about what your expectations are. So if your teen maybe is, you know, going out in the evening, not just saying, I want you home at a reasonable hour, but I expect you to be home by 10:30, and I expect you to give me a call if you're running late. Folks noted collaboration too. I think that, you know, if your teen is having difficulty with some of the rules you're setting, it can be helpful to hear kind of what their perspective is and what their values are, because your value is probably keeping the kids safe, right? And their value might be that maybe all their friends get home at 11, so they're missing that last half an hour of hanging out. And maybe there's some flexibility that you feel on your end, maybe there isn't, but it can be worth having those conversations just to hear what it is, what's going on in your young person's life that's feeling important to them. And then finally, following through. So, you know, if you have said that, you know, if you're not home by 10:30, you're not going to be allowed to go out the next night, it is really important to follow through and not permit them to go out the next night. For two reasons. One is we know that if they learn that your kind of the natural consequences that you have set aren't really serious, then they're not going to probably follow them the next time. The other is that demonstrating that you're willing to keep them home the next night sends the message that you're willing to sit with the discomfort of having to set a limit with them, and that that's more important to you. Kind of their safety is more important to you than that discomfort that you have to endure. Next slide, please. Okay, so sometimes consequences are needed. We talked about that instance of like if curfew is missed, for example. A couple of principles that families find helpful with that. One is to make it feasible. So a classic thing that I come across with families is that the child would do something wrong. Say they use the car when they're not supposed to, and the parents say, all right, that's it. You can't use the car for the next month. Two things could be a challenge there. One is what happens if they do the same thing next week, or they make another error next week? What are we then tacking on a second month and it's 2 months? Like at a certain point, we want to be finite about the consequences that we're putting into place, so you have space for more consequences if they're needed. The other is that if you need your kid to be able to drive themselves to school or pick up their sibling from softball practice, we don't want to totally make it so that all of a sudden you have to do this extra work to do that driving. So you want to really think through what's feasible for your family. And then consider natural consequences. So sometimes there's consequences built into life that are quite helpful. An example might be if your young person forgets their homework at home and they're asking you to drive it to school for them. It might actually be a better solution to allow the natural consequence of them getting a 0 for homework that day. Then you don't have to give any consequences, and you're also not going out of their way to drive their homework to school. That's just an example. Every family has different limits around that. Another is that consequences aren't ideally driven by your emotions. So many of us get angry when our kids misbehave. And we want consequences to make sense and to fit the problem and not be kind of designed to help our emotions, to help ourselves feel better. And then we talked about leaving space for future consequences. Next slide, please. Social media. We got some pre-questions about social media that we wanted to touch on. So one is that kids will often say when we try to put limits on social media, you just don't understand. And I would say start with the baseline, they're absolutely right. I did not grow up with social media until I was into my early adulthood. I don't understand what it would be like to be a middle schooler or a high schooler with access to social media. And I think it would be incredibly challenging. And so we want to kind of come from that perspective in the spirit of collaboration of like, yeah, I don't know what this is like for you, and I'm here to learn from you. Kids can be pretty savvy about, one of the sort of evidence-based techniques we have to help kids adjust their social media use is to help them be kind of conscientious consumers of social media. So that means kind of teaching them media literacy about what is it that these social media apps are trying to do. They're trying to get you to stay on the app, to advertise to you, to make more money. Kids often feel righteous about that, and that can be helpful to kind of have conversations about. Another can be interviewing your kids. Some of you maybe work in healthcare and you're trained in motivational interviewing. Sometimes it can be helpful to ask them, if you're worried about social media use, what do you like about social media? Is there anything, what if anything do you not like about social media? Thinking about parental monitoring, encouraging using phones and tablets in common spaces rather than in private spaces. If you have a younger teen who's maybe learning and getting a phone for the first time, it's generally advisable to be strict at the beginning about oversight, like maybe certain hours with the phone, and that you're going to check the phone and the apps with some regularity, and then gradually peeling that back as you begin to feel more confident about their ability to keep themselves safe on the internet, rather than trying to put on more oversight as they go. Next slide, please. Okay, diet culture. So one of my areas of specialty is eating disorders. And so I think a lot about this. So how do we protect our kids from diet culture, which is unfortunately everywhere? One of the factors that holds up the best in studies on how to prevent eating disorders are family meals. So often that's dinner, but it doesn't have to be. But finding time where your family can eat together, ideally most days or at least a few times a week, is protective against eating disorders. That can be takeout, it doesn't matter. It's just the time spent together eating that seems to be quite helpful, not just for preventing eating disorders, but for other aspects of teen being in general. And then thinking about, Evan talked about role modeling. So, many folks have complicated relationships with food, exercise, bodies. That's okay. We're all human. Thinking about what you're saying and doing in front of your kids versus what you might do in private, trying to really model body acceptance, not labeling foods as good or bad, promoting physical activity for general well-being or enjoyment, not to influence weight or shape. Those can all be powerful messages to role model for our kids. Dieting is a really powerful predictor of eating disorders. It's the most powerful predictor we have, so we don't encourage that for kids. And I would encourage families to intervene and be talking with the pediatrician if dieting is happening. We talked about media literacy. Next slide, please. Thank you. And over to my colleague, Dr. Haack.
All right, thank you. And so, Evan, I think our slides skipped ahead a bit, and we should go back to slide 20, if possible. While we're waiting, I can take a stab at one of these questions in the chat. So I see a question in the Q&A. Are there developmental differences between males and females, especially in regard to impulse control and decision making? When we get back to Q&A, I'd love to hear my colleagues' perspectives, but one thing that I know from my particular area of expertise, which is ADHD, is that we might not see differences per se in degree of difficulty with impulse control and decision making, but it may play out differently. So for instance, we may see that teen boys are demonstrating, impulse control challenges regarding to substance use and risky driving, whereas in teen girls, we're seeing it more with risky sexual behaviors, self-harm. And that's an overgeneralization, absolutely. And again, most of our research is really on, cisgendered male female categories, but that's a little bit about what we know in terms of gender differences in the teenage years, particularly for kids who have a condition that inherently has challenges with impulse control, like ADHD. So thank you, Evan, for getting those slides back. So my section that we're going to talk about is how to know when more help is needed, right? And I've already seen a question come in the chat kind of around this issue. So we know that having strong emotions, having behavioral changes in adolescence and in stressful situations is absolutely natural. However, what we really want to kind of take a look at in this section is how do we know when those are happening so consistently or they're so impactful that we might need more support. So if we go to the next slide, I'd love to get y'all thinking a little bit. We have another Menti poll here. So this says you can join at menti.com and use the code 93727471 and answer what are areas of a teen's life that may show signs that more help is needed. And so we're seeing social life, schoolwork, sleep. I'll give folks a minute to type in responses. And also, in case folks are having trouble entering that poll, we could also maybe open up the chat and folks could put thoughts in the chat. Oh, here we've got some more. Evan, if you double click on that, oh, it's okay, go back. There we go. So I'm seeing grades, mood. let's see, mine's popping up a little bit faster than I'm seeing on the screen here. So I'll just read these out. I'm seeing family interactions, too much sleep, not engaged with friends, decreased social interaction, self-harm, body language, eating habits, changes in cleanliness, fights with family, too much sleep, lying, friendships, social media use. Great. So feel free, gender dysphoria, no communication. Feel free to keep thinking about this question. And if we go to the next slide, let's start by thinking about, well, how common are mental and behavioral health conditions? And so these stats are from prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw that up to 1 in 5 teenagers were experiencing a mental health condition, a diagnosable mental health condition at any given time. And if we looked at what kind of mental health conditions are most common, we see 11% meeting criteria for mood disorder, 10% for a behavior disorder, and 8% for an anxiety disorder. Another thing that this set of statistics tells us is that 50% of all lifetime cases of mental health conditions begin by age 14 and 75% by age 24. So more likely than not, if you have an adult that is experiencing a mental health condition, that started in the teenage years. We also know that suicide prior to the pandemic was the second leading cause of death in youth ages 10 to 24. And 90% of those who have died by suicide have an underlying mental health condition. If we go to the next slide, although we'll be learning more for years to come, the emerging data is really suggesting that the pandemic made things worse globally in terms of mental health impact, with younger people and females being the most affected. But the pandemic isn't an isolated cause of the increased mental health difficulties we've been seeing for the past 15 years. So if we go to the next slide, there's a new theory that's been put forth about why we're seeing such a major increase in adolescent mental health conditions, and particularly depression. So this graphic illustrates that almost 20% of teens experienced major depression in 2021, but that wasn't always the case. And so if we can open up the chat, any guesses about what might have changed in recent years that could coincide with these increasing depression rates in teens from 2005 to now? All right, you all are pretty savvy. So if we go to our next slide, one hypothesis is that we're spending less and less time interacting with our friends in person and more time doing our social interactions via screen time online with social media. And so time with friends amongst 15 to 25-year-olds had declined 17 minutes a day by 2018. And if we go to the next slide, one driver of that in-person socialization decline very well might be social media. Around 2008, social media became more popular, more accessible, and from then it's become an even more regular part of everyone's daily lives. And so we see as time spent on social media goes up, time spent with friends in real life has gone down. And then if we go to our next slide, when we match all of these trends together, it becomes a pretty compelling picture, right? So on the right here, the red line shows that the increase, or the blue line shows an increase in social media use. The green line shows the decline in seeing friends in person every year from 2008 to 2017. So of course, we have more to understand about these associations. One hypothesis is the displacement theory, which says that social media is basically taking the place of those in-person relationship times. However, others think it might be that loneliness and limited social support in real life is causing the increase in social media use. So it's really a complicated question. And it's also important to highlight that there can be some benefits to social support gained through some kind of social media use, and that there's really a need to look at the different types of social media and how associated that use is with levels of supportiveness or negative outcomes. And so we'll be providing some resources for evaluating apps and social media platforms, as well as tips for parents regarding social media use later in this workshop and in our slides. So this is just one example we just dove into regarding the association between social media use, which is a typical teen behavior, which can sometimes be helpful, but sometimes be harmful, and the association with depression. And so this leads us to our main question. If we go to the next slide, what behaviors are typical for teens and what behaviors are concerning? And so if we look at technology and screen time, social media and privacy, on the left here, we see it's pretty typical for teens to have a strong interest in technology and social media and an increased desire for privacy. If we're seeing that this is turning into many hours a day spent on devices to the detriment of real-world socializing, if we're seeing engagement with high risk or triggering content, casually meeting partners online or revealing too much, and also isolation from families where we're breaking down communication, if we see routine lying and hiding things, that might be where we're now kind of tipping the scales to being concerned. And then our next slide, let's take a look at two typical teen parts of our lives, sleep and school. So it's actually biologically hardwired that teenagers have a shift in their sleep cycle where their brains and their bodies are preferring to stay up later and sleep late on the weekends. It's biologically something that's going to happen. However, if we see that this is then translating to them being up nearly all night and then sleeping all day on the weekends, so they're basically experiencing severe jet lag every single week. If they're routinely late or missing school or activities because of their sleep schedule, that might be a point where we're concerned. I'm sure everyone can remember that transitions to middle school and high school are inherently stressful, right? Changes in our routine are certainly something that it's really typical to have some stress, some anxiety. But if that's leading into school refusal, if we're seeing that those transitions are accompanied by bullying or being bullied, they're really not having connection to school or their peers, they're not going, they're really behind, they're at risk of failure or dropout, then that's leading us into the realm of being more concerned. Let's talk about mood and anxiety. So increased moodiness is absolutely part of adolescence, right? Again, these are sort of biological driven reasons that teens and their hormone shifts are having more moodiness. If we're seeing, though, that they're having intense, painful, long-lasting moods, they're really having risky behavior dependent on their mood, or if we're seeing symptoms reflective of major depression or panic attacks, if we're seeing that they're cutting themselves, scratching, burning themselves, or having suicidal thinking, that's a point of concern. And so the next slides show some really nice resources from the National Institutes of Mental Health. And so this infographic is called Teen Depression More Than Just Moodiness, and it outlines the actual symptoms of major depressive disorder, and then has some tips for how to manage depression and get more support for that. The next slide talks about suicide. So, what are warning signs of suicide? What are changes in behavior that might sort of perk up our flags for this? And then what are some help crisis resources? Next slide, someone asked about decision-making in the chat. It's really typical to be stressed about everyday decision-making in adolescence. It's sort of the first time in their lives where they're having some agency for making big decisions. If they're becoming paralyzed with indecision, we might be more concerned. And if we go to the next slide, there's again some NIMH resources on how anxiety is different than worry, which all of us experience. And the next slide has an infographic on the difference between stress, which is a natural human experience, and anxiety. It also has some ways to cope and some suggestions for getting more help. All right, the next slides, we're going to talk quickly about attention and behavior. So very typical for teens to have increased dawdling and daydreaming, increased sense of invulnerability, right? Sort of nothing can touch me, nothing bad's going to happen to me. But if we're seeing that they're so distracted to the point where they're not completing their homework or their daily tasks, their daily routines, they're regularly late for things. And if we're seeing risky behavior translate into accidents or encounters with firearms or really concerning risk-taking behavior, getting arrested, that might be signs for needing more support. I'm sure you all have experienced that some increased argumentativeness, criticism, idealism, opinionated stances, and parent-adolescent conflict is really typical. If we're getting to the point of really rebellious questioning of social rules that are causing trouble with others, or verbal or physical aggression or running away behavior, we're definitely going to want to look for more support. And then the next slide shows some, this is a really nice handout for attention and behavior concerns like ADHD from NIMH. And then the next slide has a nice resource from Attitude magazine, which I always recommend in terms of what's the kind of differential from just teen behavior and potentially something like ADHD. Okay, 2 more areas here. And it's typical for teens to experiment with drugs, alcohol, or cigarettes, but if that use of substances is negatively impacting their mood, their schoolwork, or their social life, then we're in a realm of being more concerned. The next slide has some resources for substance use and co-occurring mental health conditions from NIMH. And then lastly, increased self-consciousness, feelings like you're on stage, increased focus on body image is really typical. But if we're seeing that this is causing them to withdraw, have really unrealistic standards, or actually alter behavior to alter their body, if they're having obsessive or neglectful behaviors related to their hygiene, we might want to reach out for more support. And again, just a few more wrap-up resources on social anxiety and how that's different than shyness. Eating disorders. So I know someone put a question about this in the chat. I encourage you to get out your phone, save this QR code. You can also just search NIMH for all of these infographics and resources that I've been putting up. And then lastly, NIMH has a really nice sort of summary resource for this question. Is this just a stage? Is this typical child development? Or is this a mental health condition? The bottom line is that if your teen is consistently unable to engage in social and family relationships, or they're really having trouble at school and at home tasks, if they're expressing self-harm or suicidal ideation, we would recommend seeking support. And so we have some resources. I think that you all will have access to these, the PDFs where you can see all of our links and our QR codes. I want to make sure, I know we did not save as much time as we had hoped for question and answers, but I think some of us can hang on for a bit here. So I'd welcome my co-panelists to come on back.
Thanks, Lauren and Lindsay. And yes, you will have access to all of these resources to dig deeper. But we wanted to make sure that we save some time for the Q&As. So let's see, start at the top. There's a question about eating disorders. I'll direct that to Lindsay.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I like the resource that Lauren shared. So searching NIMH eating disorders would give some good tips and tricks. on our UCSF CAP, Child and Adolescent Psychiatry portal website. We also have a caregiver handout on eating disorders that's quite helpful. That might be embedded in our resources as well. But I would say following up with the pediatrician if you have concerns.
Awesome. Thanks. Someone anonymous asked, please say more about a healthy reward system. I'll kind of take a stab at this. So as Lindsey said, sometimes you don't need like a full, like a sticker chart or something that's very formal, but it's really good to just try to look for any difference, movement towards a behavior, a desirable behavior, right? And praise that verbally. You also can be really explicit, right, about rewards or things that your child will look forward to. You want it to be something that's relevant and something that's like pro-social, right? And something that isn't too extravagant either, because if you give a really big reward, then they're going to start to expect that over time. I'm not sure if that answers the part about the healthy reward system. So if you have a follow-up, please feel free to type that. Next, we have a question about with increased social media use. And maybe I'll direct that to Lauren.
Yeah, so I would recommend maybe, Evan, if we could share slide 55. One of my favorite resources is called the One Mind Cyber Guide. And this answers a couple of the questions I saw in the chat about like, how do we evaluate like some of these social media or online things that our teens are doing? And if they're saying, oh, I'm getting a lot of benefit out of this because of the social interaction. This One Mind Cyber Guide has a really nice free sort of evaluation of different online platforms and tools. And then another resource that I would recommend is called commonsensemedia.org. I know we have that as well somewhere in our slides, and that has some really nice resources, again, kind of evaluating different online apps and platforms, and then it also has some tips for parents about how to talk to your teens about family expectations, limits for screen time use. So I'll put that in the chat as well.
Thanks, Lauren. Scrolling through, there's a lot of great questions. I'm picking one that I think might be really relevant. Any advice on how much freedom to give kids by age range around curfew, homework, oversight? So again, you can think about this very broadly, kind of as a gradient from younger adolescents into older, and wanting to give more freedom and more autonomy, right? Supported, you can scaffold that by helping them think through what will help them be successful, right? And then also giving feedback, right, about modifications that might need to be made. It's also important as you do give that kind of increased freedom to assert yourself in a confident, calm way as the parent, caregiver, right, who is going to make the ultimate call on those things, actually earlier in adolescence. There's a question about gender dysphoria. Say something about a 13-year-old biological girl experiencing gender dysphoria. Lindsey or Lauren, either of you want to take that?
Yeah. So, I don't know all the details here, of course, but I think, one of the things that is best predictive of well-being for kids who experience gender dysphoria is having an affirming family who supports kind of hearing about their identity and affirming that identity. So I think kind of talking with them about where they're at and what they're experiencing, and then maybe starting with a conversation with a pediatrician if you feel your pediatrician is going to be gender affirming. If you feel like your pediatrician is not going to be gender affirming, that to me would be a reason to switch pediatricians or to consider that, because that is really important. But perhaps talking with the pediatrician about next steps in terms of resources. And the UCSF Gender Clinic is a really good resource as well. There's another online resource called Gender Spectrum, which is an excellent website that has great resources for families.
Thanks, Lindsay. And again, we know this is the end of our technical time, but Lindsay and I are going to stick around and try to work through as many of these questions as we can. There's some really great ones. I'm going to go to one that's kind of more in my wheelhouse around substance use. One parent asked, how might a parent handle their teen, 15 years, expressing a desire to continue vaping and using marijuana despite repeated consequences? It's important to, to think about. It's a great question, and one I think is probably relevant for a lot of people, is to think about approaching that people, including teens, are not likely to want to change their behavior by people telling them, you need to do this, you're wrong, right? Even if that is kind of possible or likely, that they're not seeing some positive results. So I think Lindsay highlighted some natural consequences, right? Of I'm not sure exactly what the consequences are, but you can help kind of reflect back, what some of those natural consequences might be. It also can be really helpful to reorient your team to what their values are and what their goals are, and to help think about in a non-judgmental way as you can about whether or not that behavior is helping them reach their goals. And ultimately, experimenting with substance use can be it is pretty normal, right? Especially as teens get older. And at the same time, thinking about what those consequences are, right? Especially related to safety and when you should intervene is whenever there is a really serious safety issue around that substance use. And then ultimately deciding sometimes substance use treatment is really indicated if those consequences are severe or impacting their safety. It's a question about opinions on wearing binders for a young adolescent. I'll direct that to Lindsay.
Yeah. So again, hard to know without more detail. But I think that we know gender affirmation is really important. And so usually when young people are choosing to wear binders, it is because that's helping them feel their appearance is more consistent with their gender identity. I know there can be some physical things to consider when wearing binders. So I would recommend discussing that with the young person's pediatrician. And again, just thinking carefully about whether that pediatrician is likely to be gender affirming. Gender Spectrum might also have some helpful resources there. I'm not positive about that.
Someone highlighted identifying teen needs help versus getting that help is a different thing. So just want to validate that our service system is very flawed and very challenging, and it's something as clinicians we empathize with, and it frustrates us too, especially when it's very clear that teens and families could use that help. And so I would just encourage you to, as it sounds like you are here, to advocate, right? You know your teen and your family best, to advocate for what they need. And unfortunately, that means taking a lot of time and energy, right, to like call insurance companies, figure out what's happening. We were hopeful that some of the resources in the slides that will be passed out can help. There are a lot of resources around different behavioral health apps and also around finding therapists. But being that squeaky wheel is really essential. And I'm sorry that it's that way, but that's one of the most important things you can do is to advocate and not stay quiet. Let's see. I have another question on teens being bullied. They're talking to their school about it and there seems to be no actions. Should a parent intervene? Absolutely. I think this is another place where you follow your gut. But especially if, not especially if, but because it shouldn't really need to get to the level where it's impacting your teen's attendance or their academic performance or their mood. So it's important to make sure it doesn't really get to that point, right? Everybody, it's a civil right to have an access to an education, to your education. And so schools do have a responsibility to respond to bullying effectively. And so you should absolutely intervene.
And about helping a middle school boy not involved in athletics, loves his screen time to socialize more, concerned about lack of connections. It's a hard thing to teach. Agreed. Been diagnosed with ADHD and has some issues with social cues. Yeah, so I guess as you've already been thinking about this, but I think trying to find structured opportunities would be most helpful, especially if, I think middle school is a challenging time for many young people with social development because it's a time when usually it's shifting from parents making play dates to kids making sort of play or get together plans on their own. So if there's any opportunity to find other structured activities that aren't athletically oriented, if that's not your kiddo's cup of tea, San Francisco Parks and Rec does some cool summer programs, especially as kids are getting into high school, or they can even earn some money. So sometimes art programs, or even sometimes there's social activities that do revolve around gaming. And like there used to be a Minecraft social group. I don't know if that still exists. That was down in the peninsula, but things like that might be things to look into.
Another, I think our last question is, how do you get your teen to buy into therapy? And this might actually be one of the most important among a lot of important questions. Going back to what I said about substance use, right? Is when people are kind of told, you have to do this, you need to do this, we usually will kind of fight back or dig in a little bit. That's normal, but especially pronounced in adolescence. So I think one thing that I find is really important is to not identify your teen as the problem, as the teen who needs to get help. And going back to modeling, I'm not saying you necessarily need therapy yourself, but like considering if you do, or if family therapy would be really helpful. So that's one way that can be effective, is to kind of think about getting the whole family involved, right? So that it's not like, oh, this teen needs to get fixed. Again, I'm saying this not knowing much about the diagnosis or the treatment needs. There's a lot more there. When in doubt, set up an appointment, go in and talk to the therapist yourself, and tell them, what some of the challenges have been. Thank you all so much for those questions. I'll pass it back to Natalie.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And thank you to Evan, Lindsey, and Lauren for your awesome presentation. As we mentioned, we have recorded this and we'll make it available, as well as the slides. And also wanted to give a huge shout out to Benjamin, who's been supporting behind the scenes with ETS services. So have a great afternoon, and thank you, everyone. Bye.